You are interfering with an active investigation.
Step aside right now, or you will be placed under arrest.
We are not going to ask you again. Move!
The morning before the federal courthouse began like any other, quiet, without drama. Only the gentle breeze rustling the cold stone steps and the steady sound of familiar court officials' footsteps. This place was built to represent order, justice, and the belief that everyone who walks through these doors is treated equally before the law. But in just a few short minutes, right there, something completely different happened. A black woman walked toward the main entrance with a steady gait, dressed in a neat business suit, carrying a sturdy leather briefcase, her face calm. Accustomed to early mornings and responsibilities that allowed no room for error. Before she could reach the steps, a harsh voice rang out from behind, shattering the silence. "Stop! What are you doing here?" The speaker was Security Officer David Miller, a large man with cold eyes and an undisguised contempt in his voice. The woman turned around, maintaining her composure. "Officer, I have business inside the courthouse," she replied slowly, neither raising her voice nor protesting. But Miller didn't listen. He took a step forward, gesturing toward the public walkway, as if dismissing an intruder. "You don't belong here. Go somewhere else." The woman tilted her head slightly, her voice still even. "I belong here." That single sentence completely changed Miller's demeanor. His face darkened, his teeth clenched as if personally insulted. Without another word, Miller reached out and grabbed her wrist, so forcefully that her briefcase slipped from her grasp, falling onto the stone pavement with a dry, resounding clang in front of the courthouse gate. She stumbled for a moment, trying to regain her balance on her high heels, but she didn't struggle or scream. Miller turned and whistled to a colleague. "Jones, come here. Help me get this woman out." A few seconds later, two men grabbed her arms and dragged her back from the main entrance. Her heels scraped against the stone, her briefcase dragged across the floor, the files inside rattling as if about to fall out. The courthouse doors behind them seemed to freeze. Staff stood, motionless in the doorway, some covering their mouths, others silently pulling out their phones to record the scene unfolding before them. And at the center of it all, the black woman remained. Silent. She didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't react emotionally. She held her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, clinging to the one thing no brute could snatch away from her, her dignity. Right in the place that is supposed to be a symbol of justice, a man was dragged away as if he had no right to exist, and no one at that moment knew that this act was not merely an abuse of power, but the beginning of a collapse that would expose an entire system behind the seemingly impenetrable doors of the courthouse. Following that morning's events, the video of the black woman being dragged outside the courthouse quickly spread within the agency and beyond, causing a shock not only because of its brutality, but also because of the location where it occurred. But for Officer David Miller, everything remained within the safe zone of confidence. He believed he had done the right thing, that his badge and 15 years of experience were enough to protect him from any unpleasant questions. A few weeks later, in the cold, white-lit courtroom, Miller ascended the witness stand with the gait of someone who had no idea his fate was on the brink of collapse. His defense attorney, a well-dressed middle-aged man, began with familiar questions as if reproducing a model case file. "Officer Miller, how long have you worked at this court?" Miller straightened his back, his voice clear and resonant. 15 years, sir. I've been security here since I joined the force." The lawyer nodded, appearing satisfied. "And during that time, were you trained in security procedures?" "Yes, very thoroughly. I knew every passageway, every restricted area, and how to handle intruders," Miller said proudly, as if recounting a commendable achievement. The lawyer continued, to steer the conversation in a favorable direction. "That morning, were you working under normal conditions?" Miller shook his head, immediately bringing up the circumstances. "No, sir. I was filling in because a colleague was unexpectedly ill. I usually work the night shift. It's very rare for me to be on morning duty." That answer implied that any mistakes, if any, stemmed from unforeseen circumstances. "So, were you familiar with all the people who regularly came and went from the courthouse in the morning?" Miller shrugged slightly. "Not really. There are many judges, lawyers, and clerks during the day. I didn't interact with them regularly because my shift was different. The defense attorney immediately seized on that detail as a lifeline. So you couldn't recognize all the new faces? That's right, Miller replied quickly. Then he added, not realizing he was digging a hole. In my entire career, I've seen very few black judges. And the woman that morning didn't look like any judge I know. The courtroom murmured softly, but Miller continued, believing he was stating the obvious. He described the morning in the tone of someone who considered himself the last line of defense. Around 6:45, I saw that woman heading toward the restricted entrance. That's the area reserved for judges and authorized personnel. The attorney pressed further. Did she present any identification? Miller shook his head emphatically. No. No badge, no papers, nothing to prove she was allowed in. And what did you do? I asked her to leave according to procedure. When she didn't comply, I was forced to call for backup. The lawyer leaned slightly toward the jury. Did you use excessive force? Miller immediately replied. Without hesitation, he said, no. We were just escorting her out of the public area, completely according to regulations. He chose the word escort as a way to soften the image of two men dragging a woman out of courthouse. The lawyer continued to bolster his defense. At that point, could you have called administration to verify her identity? Miller shook his head. No, sir. Administration wasn't open at that time. If everyone claimed they had the right to enter and demanded verification, security would be meaningless. Miller uttered those words with a sense of righteousness, as if he were the only one standing between order and chaos. At the end of the main questioning, Miller sat upright in the witness chair, his face unwavering. In his mind, the story was already clear. An officer doing his duty, an undocumented woman, a necessary decision to protect security. He didn't realize that his self-confidence, those seemingly harmless words, were gradually painting a portrait of himself before the entire courtroom, and that in just a few minutes, layer after layer of the procedure he clung to would begin to be peeled away, revealing a truth he was completely unprepared to face. The moment the defense attorney sat down, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed noticeably. Attorney Laura Chen rose from the opposite row, unhurried and expressionless. She walked slowly toward the witness stand, carrying a thin file, but her eyes were sharp, as if she already knew the entire course of the interrogation. She didn't need to start with big questions. She began with something small. Officer Miller, you said you've been working the night shift for almost 10 years, right? Miller nodded, maintaining his confident demeanor. Yes. Chen continued, her voice even. So, when was the last time you were updated on the list of judges working at this court? The seemingly simple question made Miller pause for a moment. That's not part of my regular duties. Chen nodded slightly, as if she had been waiting for that answer. So you're not sure you know all the judges working during the morning hours? Miller became a little more flustered. No, I don't know any of them. Chen took another step forward. Do you know that 3 weeks before the incident, this court had a new judge appointed? Miller swallowed hard. No, I wasn't informed. Chen turned to the jury for a very brief moment, then turned back. You said you relied on paperwork to determine who was allowed into the restricted area. So that morning, did you ask the woman what kind of paperwork she was carrying? Miller frowned. I asked her to present it. Chen shook his head, his voice still calm. I'm not asking if you asked. I'm asking if you asked her what kind of paperwork she was carrying. Federal ID, appointment letter, court personnel card. Miller was silent. The silence lasted long, enough for the entire courtroom to feel it. No, he replied softly. Chen didn't stop. So before using force, what minimum verification steps did you take? Miller clung to his familiar lifeline. She wasn't cooperating. Chen tilted his head. Not cooperating, or not being given the opportunity to cooperate. A few murmurs arose in the courtroom. Chen continued, each question a rhythmic tap on the crumbling wall of defense. In your 15 years of service, how many people have you removed from the courtroom? Miller answered with an estimate. About 15 to 20 times. Chen looked straight ahead. Of those, how many were black women in business attire? The defense attorney rose to object, but the question had already struck everyone's mind. Miller stammered, unable to answer. Chen didn't need the numbers. She shifted the topic. You stated that you don't judge people by their appearance, but you also said that woman didn't look like a judge. So, can you be more specific? In your mind, what does a judge look like? Miller opened his mouth, then closed it again. Any answer at this point would be self-incriminating. Chen slowly concluded with Miller's own words. He didn't know the list of judges. He didn't ask for papers. He didn't verify. But he still decided that she didn't belong there. That decision wasn't based on procedure. It was based on personal feeling. Chen paused, letting the words linger in the room. Miller began to lose his initial composure. His shoulders slumped, his gaze averted. His so-called 15 years of experience was no longer a shield, but proof of a deeply ingrained habit. And in that moment, the entire courtroom realized that this story wasn't about a momentary blunder, but about how a man so accustomed to power believed he could decide who deserved to walk through the doors of justice with just a glance. When Officer Miller left the witness stand, his face no longer bearing its initial confidence, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Attorney Laura Chun rose again, this time not toward Miller, but toward the black woman who had sat silently throughout the trial. Please welcome witness Maria Alvarez. The woman stood up. Her approach to the stand was distinctly different from Miller's earlier. Not hurried, not defensive, not nervous of someone defending herself. She walked with the composure of someone accustomed to facing important decisions. After taking the oath, Maria Alvarez sat upright, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her gaze fixed, her voice clear and steady. Chen began with a seemingly ordinary question. What time did you arrive at the court that morning? Around 6:45, Maria answered without hesitation. Why did you arrive so early? Maria tilted her head slightly, as if this question were all too familiar to her. I have a habit of arriving early to prepare. I need quiet time to review documents, check my schedule, and mentally prepare for the day's responsibilities. The way she spoke of preparation didn't sound like a typical commuter, but rather like someone who understood the consequences of not preparing. Chun continued. Which entrance were you planning to use? The private entrance I usually use, Maria said, then added. But that morning the electronic door system malfunctioned, so I was forced to go through the main entrance. Chun nodded. When Officer Miller approached you, what happened? Maria took a shallow breath. Her voice didn't tremble, but it held the cold steel of someone recounting something unacceptable. He approached me hostilely from the start. He didn't ask who I was, didn't ask what I was doing. He said I didn't belong there. Chen continued. Did he ask for your identification? No, Maria answered decisively. He didn't ask what kind of papers I was carrying. He didn't give me a chance to explain. Chen looked directly at the jury. So what happened when you tried to speak? Maria maintained a steady tone. I said that I had business in the court and that I belonged there. That's when he became more aggressive. She recounted the moment her wrist was grabbed, her briefcase falling to the stone floor, the feeling of losing her balance in her high heels, and the whistle calling for a colleague. I didn't resist, Maria said slowly. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I understood that resisting at that moment would only make things worse. Chen asked the question the courtroom was waiting for. How did that affect you? Maria looked straight ahead. I was publicly insulted. I was treated like someone who had no right to exist in my own workplace. The word workplace caused many in the courtroom to slightly raise their heads. Chen didn't miss. You said workplace? Maria nodded slightly. Yes. Chen continued, but without pressing. What was your obligation in court? That morning, Maria replied, each word carefully chosen. I had professional obligations at 9 o'clock in the morning. Those obligations directly involved many other people and did not allow me to be late or unprepared. Defense attorney Sanchez stood up to object, trying to interrupt the conversation. But when given the opportunity to cross-examine, he chose his familiar attack. Ms. Alvarez, if you truly had the right to be there, why didn't you simply present your credentials to avoid this? Maria turned to him, her gaze not angry, just cold. I wasn't asked to present any. And even if I were, no one deserves to be dragged around and humiliated just for not having had time to show a badge. Sanchez emphasized. But you understand security must be strict. Maria replied, her voice calm but sharp. I understand security better than you think. And I also understand the difference between security and prejudice. Sanchez pressed on. So what do you do for a living? Maria paused for a very brief moment, enough for the entire room to feel the change in atmosphere. I work in the justice system. Sanchez frowned. Specifically, Maria looked straight ahead. her voice lowering. If I state my title now, the entire courtroom's perspective will change. But I want Officer Miller's actions judged on what he did, not on who I am. That statement fell upon the courtroom like a silent warning. This woman was not just a victim. She understood the law. She understood power. And she was deliberately withholding a truth that could reverse the entire situation. Waiting for the right moment to speak it. Wait for the right moment to say it. Wait for the right moment to say it. 3 weeks before that fateful morning, in a solemn hall of this very court, a ceremony took place that went largely unnoticed by the public, but was legally of paramount importance. Chief Justice Sofia Lopez stood before the podium, holding the appointment document, her voice clear and resonant in the silent room. When she called Maria Alvarez's name, the entire court rose. Maria stepped forward, placed her hand on the oath, her gaze calm, yet resolute. That moment marked an irreversible transformation. From someone who had once stood before the court as a prosecutor, Maria officially became part of the judicial branch. Press cameras flashed. Court staff applauded. The appointment document was signed, stamped, and archived in the official system. Procedurally, from that moment on, Maria Alvarez not only belonged to this court, but was also one of its representatives. Yet elsewhere in the same building, the night shift continued as usual. David Miller wasn't present at the ceremony. He didn't attend the staff meeting. He didn't read the internal newsletter. And, more importantly, there was no mechanism requiring him to stay updated on those crucial changes. In the court's security system, knowing who had authority was considered less critical than knowing the layout of the building and the locks on the doors. A silent, but dangerous, loophole had existed for a long time. After the incident, Maria didn't go home to rest or try to forget. She sat in her office, in front of her computer screen, opening frame by frame from the security camera footage she had requested. She replayed the moment she was stopped, then rewound the footage. Day after day, the more she watched, the colder her face became. What unfolded before her eyes was no longer an isolated incident. It was a recurring sequence. An Asian lawyer detained for an unusually long time. A black court employee being asked to show identification at an entrance that had been in use for years. A law professor being harshly questioned while others passed through without hindrance. Each video clip, in itself, could be interpreted as random, but when placed together, they formed a picture that no justification could obscure. Maria continued reviewing internal complaint files. 7 complaints in 2 years. None had been investigated thoroughly. All were closed with the same vague reason: insufficient evidence. The only common thread among the complainants was their skin color and the feeling of being treated as outsiders. She continued reviewing Miller's performance reviews. The seemingly positive statements appeared: proactive, disciplined, sensitive to risk. But Maria understood that in administrative language, those words could mask a great deal. Especially when risk wasn't clearly defined, it could easily be twisted into a personal, prejudiced perception. Maria's assistant brought in more training files. Miller hadn't attended bias and civil rights training for years, always citing overlapping shifts. Yet, during that same period, he had fully participated in weapons and coercive techniques training. This showed a clear preference: learning to control people by force, but not learning to understand people through understanding. Maria set the stack of files down on the table, looking at her own sworn-in photo hanging on the wall. The oath to uphold justice suddenly felt heavier than ever. She understood that if she viewed this as merely a personal humiliation, the system would continue to function as before. But if she saw it as a sign of a deeper disease, her responsibility would no longer be silence. Maria picked up the phone and called Chief Justice Lopez. "I want to pursue this to the end," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not just for myself, but for those who have been left in a position to speak out." There was a silence on the other end. Then the Chief Justice's voice rang out, deep and stern. "If you do, you will shake the entire system." Maria replied without hesitation. If the system shakes for the truth, then it needs to be shaken. And from that moment, the story was no longer about an officer pulling the wrong person. It became a confrontation between a system accustomed to shielding itself and a woman determined to use the law itself to force that system to look in the mirror. As the trial entered the expanded evidence presentation phase, Laura Chen rose with a request that immediately drew the attention of the entire courtroom. She requested permission to show video footage from the court's security camera system for the 6 months prior to the incident. Not one clip, not two, but a continuous sequence. The large screen behind the jury lit up, and instantly, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. The first clip showed an Asian American lawyer in a formal suit, carrying a briefcase, walking toward the entrance. Officer Miller appeared in the frame, stopping him and ordering him to stop, his voice stern. The man presented his lawyer's badge, then was asked for further documentation and detained for a few minutes while others passed. Chen let the video finish without comment. Then she moved on to the next clip. That same day, just minutes later, a white woman in casual clothes walked toward the same entrance, appearing flustered for having entered through the wrong door. Miller smiled, softly giving directions, without asking for any documents. The contrast was too obvious to ignore. The video clips followed one another. Like regular cuts, a black court employee was stopped at the staff entrance she'd used for years, bombarded with questions as if she'd trespassed. An Asian law professor was asked to produce 3 different sets of documents just to attend a public trial. Each time, Miller's demeanor was the same, tense, suspicious, controlling. And each time, white people in the same situation were let through with unbelievable ease. Chen turned to Miller. "You call these isolated incidents?" Miller swallowed. "Each incident has a different context." Chen nodded. "Right. But when the context repeats itself, the same group of people suspected and another not, it's no longer a coincidence." Chen began calling the witnesses. The Asian lawyer stepped up to the stand, his voice low but clear. "I've practiced law for over 20 years. Never before have I been treated as a threat simply for walking into court until I met this officer." Next came the black court clerk, who spoke through suppressed tears. "I've worked here for 8 years. But that day, I had to prove I belonged where I'd dedicated nearly a decade." Each testimony didn't need to be dramatic, just truthful. And it was this repeated truth that weighed heavily on the courtroom. Chen turned to the internal complaints file. 7 complaints in 2 years, she said, her voice even. None were fully investigated. She called Miller's direct supervisor to the podium. In response to questions about the reasons for closing the file, he responded with evasive, familiar phrases like professional, evaluation, and no clear violations found. Chen didn't argue. She simply asked, "Did you know that all the complainants were people of color?" The supervisor remained silent. That silence spoke, louder than any explanation. Then Chen presented the statistical analysis. The numbers appeared on the screen, cold and emotionless. Miller's rate of stopping and requesting additional documentation from people of color was many times higher than that for white people. The tense interactions and use of force were limited to a specific group. Chen looked directly at the jury. "This isn't feeling. This is data." Miller bowed his head. At this point, the story had transcended his personal experience. It exposed a tolerated pattern, a habit mistakenly called occupational vigilance. And the entire courtroom understood that without intervention, this pattern would continue to repeat itself with new victims, those without cameras, without lawyers, and without a position to force the system to listen. When Laura Chen finished her video presentation, the courtroom was still catching its breath when she moved on to the next piece of evidence, the one she knew would shatter any remaining defenses. Chen requested permission to play an audio recording from the security lounge's internal system. The defense attorney rose to protest, but the judge, after reviewing the evidence's source and legitimacy, nodded in approval. The room fell silent as the speakers went off. The voice that came through wasn't that of an officer on duty, but the relaxed, uninhibited voice of someone who believed they were unheard. It was David Miller's voice. No flowery language, no procedural language, just prejudiced pronouncements, describing people of color entering the courtroom as if they were a nuisance needing to be controlled. Each statement resonated like a hammer blow to the image of a person doing their job right, that Miller had tried to cultivate since the beginning of the trial. Some jurors bowed their heads, some closed their eyes as if unwilling to hear more, but no one could deny what was present in the room, the true thinking behind the badge. Chen didn't interrupt the recording. She let it play to the end, letting Miller speak for himself. When the sound faded, The silence was so long you could hear the faint rustling of paper. Chun turned to Miller. "Is that your voice?" Miller replied hoarsely, "Yes." "Do you deny these words?" Miller shook his head slightly. "No. Those 2 words alone were enough to change the whole story. Because from that moment, any justifications about professional instinct or situational reaction became meaningless. What Miller did wasn't a momentary reflex. It was the consistent expression of a deeply ingrained belief. Chun continued with the final piece of the puzzle, cold and unquestionable. She presented a statistical analysis report compiled by an independent expert, based on hundreds of recorded security interactions. The numbers loomed large. Miller's rate of stopping and questioning black people was many times higher than that of white people. The rate of requesting additional identification was almost absolute for a particular group, and, notably, all instances of forceful use fell into the same demographic group. Chun didn't need to raise her voice. "These numbers don't lie," she said. "They don't care about feelings, nor do they care about explanations. They simply reflect repetitive behavior." The defense attorney tried to salvage the situation, questioning the pressures of the profession and the security risks. But at this point, all arguments sounded weak. The data didn't show Miller faced more risks from people of color, only that he believed they were more dangerous. Chun concluded this section with a short statement, but enough to slam shut the last escape route. This wasn't a personal mistake. This was a pattern of behavior that was repeated, tolerated, and masked by the language of power. Miller sat motionless in the defendant's chair. His face was no longer that of a confident officer, but that of someone who had just realized everything he believed to be normal was being exposed under the harsh glare of the law. And as the presentation of evidence concluded, the entire courtroom felt one thing very clearly. This story had gone far beyond the right or wrong of a single morning. It had become an indictment of an entire way of thinking, a system that had allowed prejudice to take on the uniform of security. In that heavy atmosphere, all eyes turned toward Maria Alvarez, who sat upright, unusually calm, as if she knew that the most decisive moment was yet to come. And when it did, the truth would not only overturn the trial, but also the entire story David Miller had told from the beginning. As the atmosphere in the courtroom thickened with video, audio recordings, and undeniable evidence, Laura Chun rose again, this time in a lower, slower voice, as if she knew she was entering a moment that would shift the entire trial. She turned toward Maria Alvarez, who remained seated upright, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her gaze so calm it was almost detached from the surrounding commotion. "Mrs. Alvarez," Chun said, "you stated that you had professional duties that morning at 9 o'clock. Please tell the court specifically what those duties were." The courtroom fell silent. Maria slightly raised her head, took a very light breath, and then answered in a clear voice, neither high nor low, but loud enough for each word to carry. "I came to court that morning to preside over the criminal trial scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock. A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom, but many had yet to fully grasp the meaning of the statement. Chun did not allow the ambiguity to linger. "In what capacity? Do you say presiding judge?" Maria looked straight ahead, her gaze unwavering, her voice now carrying a different weight, as if the entire room automatically adjusted to her rhythm. "I am Federal Judge Maria Catherine Alvarez. I was appointed to this court 3 weeks prior to this event." In that moment, time seemed to stand still. A few gasps escaped from the back rows. Some turned to the person next to them, some blurted out words, and then immediately fell silent. Officer David Miller sat motionless, his face visibly pale, his hands on the table trembling slightly, as if he could no longer maintain his balance. His lawyer dropped his pen to the floor without bending down to pick it up. The presiding judge had to strike the gavel repeatedly to restore order. But even the sound of the gavel couldn't mask the shock that had just occurred. The court clerk stood up to confirm, his voice still slightly shaky. According to court records, Judge Maria Alvarez was indeed assigned to preside over the criminal hearing scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning. Those words sealed an irreversible truth. The woman dragged outside the courthouse was not a random citizen, not a stranger, but the very person who should have been sitting on the stand in this very room that morning. Chun turned to the jury, each word spoken slowly. Officer Miller did not merely obstruct a citizen. He obstructed a federal judge from performing his duty. All the previous details suddenly changed meaning. The colleagues watching from the door were no longer bystanders. The important duties were no longer vague words. The delay in the morning hearing now appeared as a direct consequence of the abuse of power. Chun turned to Miller. Do you understand what that means? Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Finally, he stammered. I don't know. Maria leaned toward the microphone, her voice calm but sharp. You don't know because you didn't ask. He didn't ask because he decided who I was at first sight. That statement echoed through the courtroom like a moral judgment. At this point, no one could console themselves that this was merely an unfortunate misunderstanding. A security officer had used his power to humiliate and obstruct the very person representing the justice system, simply because that person didn't fit his preconceived notion of power. And in that moment, everyone understood that this trial would not end with an apology or a light punishment. It had become a test of the very foundation of justice that this court claimed to uphold. After Maria Alvarez's identity was revealed, the trial entered a completely different phase. No longer were there vague debates about procedure or professional ethics. Everything was now laid bare under the cold light of federal law. The prosecutor stood, his voice steady but carrying the weight of each legal provision. He began with an undeniable truth. A security officer had used state power to obstruct a federal judge from performing her duties. Not with paperwork, not with a verification call, but with force and public humiliation. The prosecutor emphasized that this was not merely unprofessional conduct. This was a violation of civil rights under the guise of authority, an abuse of power entrusted to protect, but used instead to impose and exclude. He proceeded to string together the specific consequences. The morning criminal trial was delayed. Defendants in custody had to wait in the detention room. Lawyers and victims' families had to wait in tense silence. And above all, faith in the fairness of the court was damaged right from its doorstep. The law doesn't just exist in the courtroom, the prosecutor said. It begins with how we allow someone to enter to enforce it. The defense tried to salvage the situation by reiterating familiar factors: unexpected shift changes, faulty door systems, security pressure. But those words now sounded disjointed and unweighty, because they couldn't answer the core question: why were all verification steps skipped for just one person, and that person belonged to a particular group? The jury retreated to the deliberation room. Time passed slowly, but not for long. When they returned, the jury president stood, his voice firm and unwavering. Each charge was read aloud, and with each, the word guilty echoed clearly through the room. Guilty of civil rights. Guilty of assault under duress. Guilty of obstruction of justice. David Miller slumped into his chair, his shoulders heavy as if he had just realized that the moment he had grabbed the woman's wrist at the courthouse entrance had decided everything, only he hadn't known it at the time. The presiding judge pronounced the sentence in a stern, emotionless voice. The federal prison sentence was announced, along with probation, a permanent ban from law enforcement, and community service related to civil rights. But the sentence didn't stop at 5 months. The judge announced mandatory reforms for court security, mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and a clear personnel verification process for every shift. A badge is not a license to distinguish, he said, and security cannot exist if it destroys the very foundations of justice it was created to protect. As Miller was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, there was no cheering, no boisterous glee, only a heavy feeling spread, as if everyone understood that justice had been served, but at the cost of exposing a long-standing crack. Maria Alvarez sat silently in her seat, her gaze not on Miller, nor on the jury. She looked straight ahead, where the symbol of the court hung high. The trial was over, but its repercussions extended beyond the verdict. It opened a larger question about responsibility, about power, and about how justice can mend itself when it is wounded from within. Months after the verdict, changes began to appear quietly but irreversibly within the court system. There were no grand press conferences, no slogans plastered in the hallways, just new documents issued, old procedures scrapped, and long-standing habits forced to stop. Internally, the court system called this reform by a short name: the Alvarez Protocol. Not because Maria Alvarez requested the name, but because no one could deny that her case forced the system to re-examine itself. The first new procedure directly targeted the exposed weaknesses. All security personnel, regardless of day or night shift, were required to periodically update lists of judges, prosecutors, key personnel, and any changes in assignments. Not knowing was no longer accepted as a valid excuse. Simultaneously, a mandatory verification process was implemented. Before any form of coercion could be used, security personnel had to take clear, documented, or system-based verification steps, except in cases of immediate danger. Professional intuition was no longer sufficient grounds for action. The biggest change lies in the oversight mechanism. Complaints that were previously quietly closed are now referred to an independent panel, not under the direct control of the security department. Each complaint must be reviewed, data analyzed, and a written response provided. Ignoring or superficially addressing a complaint is considered a disciplinary violation. Simultaneously, training courses on bias, civil rights, and nonviolent communication are now mandatory quarterly. Failure to attend results in suspension. There are no longer any exceptions based on shift work or seniority. Initially, there was considerable backlash. Some argued the system was overreacting, while others complained that security would become slow and ineffective. But after a short time, the numbers began to speak for themselves. The number of confrontations at courthouse gates decreased significantly. Complaints increased in the first few months, not because of increased discrimination, but because people finally believed their voices would be heard. More importantly, there were no longer the repetitive, one-sided patterns targeting the same groups of people as before. Maria Alvarez returned to her courtroom as if she had never left, but those working with her noticed a subtle change. She didn't talk much about the case. She didn't mention it in the rulings. But in every decision, every question to the lawyers and prosecutors, there was a deeper consideration for human rights. In an internal briefing, Maria said just one short sentence. Justice is not just in the verdict. It is in how we allow people into this system. There was no applause, but everyone understood the message. Elsewhere, David Miller began a new life without badges, without power. His work was simple and quiet. No one shouted orders. No one avoided his gaze out of fear. And perhaps it was in that silence that Miller first understood what it felt like to be judged by one's position, not by who one was. But this story is not told to elicit pity. It is told to emphasize one thing. The system doesn't change with an apology, but with the forced confrontation of consequences. The Alvarez Protocol didn't just exist on paper. It became a new standard, studied and adopted by other courts. Not out of fear of repeating mistakes, but because they understood that a justice system is only strong when it has the courage to correct itself. And from a seemingly ordinary morning outside the courthouse, a truth was deeply ingrained. Security must never be allowed to rise above human dignity, because when that happens, justice will be the first thing pushed out the very door it needs to protect most. Months after the trial concluded, the story of that morning outside the federal courthouse was no longer recounted with the initial outrage, but with a deeper, more poignant feeling. It became a frequently cited example in training classes, internal meetings, and lectures on civil rights and professional responsibility. Not because it was dramatic, but because it exposed a truth society often avoids. Injustice rarely begins with large-scale violence. It usually begins with a glance, an assumption, and the belief that one has the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. David Miller now lives a very different life. No more shifts, no more badges, no more authority. He does ordinary jobs, blending in with the crowd like everyone else. Some days he walks past the old courthouse, watching the free flow of people, and no one recognizes him as the man who once stood at the gate, believing himself to be the last line of defense for order. What he lost wasn't just his career, but the illusion that power could replace respect. This price isn't told for gloating, but to remind us that prejudice, when empowered, will always find a way to manifest itself in action. Maria Alvarez continued her work as a federal judge. She didn't mention the case in her speeches, nor did she turn it into a personal legend. But those who stood before her in the courtroom felt one thing very clearly. Her strictness was always accompanied by dignity, and discipline always went hand in hand with listening. She understood better than anyone that the law, without human awareness, could become a cold, emotionless tool. And that's why every decision she made carried a profound awareness of how power must be used so as not to harm the weaker. This story is not a fairy tale where good always easily triumphs. It's a reminder that justice only emerges when someone dares to stand up and force the system to look at itself. Most people who are pulled away from opportunities, unjustly suspected, and made to feel not belonging will never have the chance to stand before a court with cameras and skilled lawyers. They suffer in silence, then move on with an invisible wound in their hearts. Therefore, Maria Alvarez's case is significant not because she is a judge, but because she chose not to use her position to avoid responsibility, but to use it to open a wider door for others. If there's one final lesson to be learned from all that has happened, it's this. Justice isn't measured by who you are, but by how you're treated when others don't know who you are. When a system only works well for those in power, that's not justice, it's privilege. And any society that accepts that is eroding its own moral foundations. If this story makes you pause and think, please share it, not to stir up anger, but to remind each other that respect should never be something to prove. And if you've ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone was judged simply because they didn't fit in, remember that silence is an option, but sometimes speaking up is the only way to keep justice in check. Because sometimes the most disrespected person in the room is the one who forces the whole room to change.